This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome to the CAA Friday Night Webinar Series. Tonight, we welcome Joshua Ruff with the Long Island Museum. Joshua has been the Deputy Director of Collections with the Long Island Museum in Stony Brook, New York, which is a Smithsonian affiliate institution, for 23 years. He was also a senior lecturer in history at St. Joseph College for 20 years. He has curated nearly 60 exhibitions, including the NEH-funded reinterpretations of multiple galleries in the Long Island Museum's Carriages Museum from 2008 to 2013, Gracefully Chic in 2019, and Perfect Harmony in 2018. His publications include Delancey Kane's Tally Ho, an icon of American road coaching, in the CAA's World on Wheels 2017 publication. Lumen Martin Winter, an artist rediscovered in 2017, and Gilding the Coast, the art and design of Long Island's Great Estates 2015. Mr. Ruff is a graduate of the State University of New York at Stony Brook and Syracuse University. Welcome, Joshua. As we get going, I'd just like to remind everyone to make sure that your microphones and cameras are off. And with that, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kathleen. I want to thank the Carriage Association of America so much for inviting me here to be part of your virtual speaking series. We're all figuring out this world of online presentation, and that continues for my museum, for many museums, even as we reopen on a limited capacity and on limited hours. And in fact, I just wanted to mention our YouTube channel at the Long Island Museum has a couple of films that we've put together over the summer during the pandemic, a film about Grace Darling, our omnibus, which is the first thing that you see when you walk into the Carriage Museum, and another film about the interiors of carriages. For your information, the Long Island Museum has just reopened to our membership. Next weekend, starting on September 25th, we're reopening to the general public, and we'll have limited hours Fridays through Sundays from noon until 5. You can just get all of the information on our website. We'll be remaining free to the public for the remainder of 2020. And while not all of our buildings are open, the Carriage Museum is fully open. It would really be my great pleasure to see some of you if you ever happen to be up this way anytime soon. And I also just want to mention, of course, that from a distance, we are very, very happy to always be your research resource. We have a wonderful carriage reference library at the museum. Myself and the Long Island Museum's curator, Jonathan Oley, are happy to help you with any of your research projects. Our emails are also listed on the LIM website. So it's great to be here, great to talk about some of our beautiful European carriages tonight in the collection. And we are going to be traveling to Bavaria and the Italian peninsula by way of Stony Brook. And I think that everyone in this group knows the collection to some degree at least. You know that there are unparalleled holdings of American-made horse-drawn carriages and vehicles of every description, sleighs, trade vehicles, public transport, firefighting, pleasure driving, much, much more. And of course, within this collection of close to 200 carriages, 107 currently on display, some vehicles have a history of American ownership and use, but of course were made in Europe. Foreign carriage makers in the collection include some of the fine firms of Paris, such as Mion and Guillet, or English makers that include Holland and Holland or Peters and Sons. But the most striking contrast in the entire collection between the lighter style of American carriage building design and the European tendency towards more lavish decoration, heavier design, construction, expensive materials can be seen in the collection highlights that we're going to talk about tonight. And that's 5 vehicles in all. So if we can go to the next slide. And this is a very brief video clip that will take you into the gallery. We'll walk into the gallery and see some of these vehicles. These include 3 carriages and 1 sleigh used by the Wittelsbach House of Bavaria at Nymphenburg Palace in Munich, Germany from the mid-19th century through the early 20th, and a stunning Berlin coach that was built in the last quarter of the 18th century. That's the gold, beautiful gold coach that you see there in France, and then later used by Cardinal Gaspar Bernardo Pianetti at the Vatican before finding its way to other parts of the Italian peninsula and then finally finding its way here. These beautiful vehicles all came to Long Island in the 1950s and 60s, and they would be rare survivors anywhere, but their existence in this collection is exceptional and really provides great comparison in their elegant high-level ornamentation with the rest of the collection. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so now I'm introducing you to the prince whose family these Wittelsbach vehicles came from. And the story of the Bavarian collection, it starts with this prince who we see in the lower left-hand corner, Prince Adalbert, born in 1828, died 1875, of the ruling Wittelsbach family, Bavaria's ruling family since the 12th century, featuring a total of 6 kings from 1805 until 1918. Adalbert was the 9th child and the youngest son of King Ludwig I. Adalbert lived large portions of his life at the late 17th century Nymphenburg Palace, and we see an aerial view of it there at the top, or Schloss Nymphenburg, which is situated to the western district outside of Munich city center. We can go to the next slide. And today, this palace, which was the Wittelsbach's royal summertime residence, remains one of southern Bavaria's great state cultural assets and best places to visit. If you have been to Munich, you can appreciate just what that means. You know that some 80% of the city center, including the Wittelsbach's family's other residence, the palace, the residence in town, faced partial or total destruction at the end of World War II, making this palace's survival intact all the more important. From the palace interiors to the gardens, it's truly a wonderful place to go. I took this photograph during my visit there in July of 2014. You can take us to the next slide. Many of the more than 40 surviving historic court carriages and sleighs are now located at the Marstall Museum, which is located in the court stables at the palace and has been there since 1923. The stables block was built originally in 1719. In the wintertime, the royal household's horses and carriages were kept in the center of Munich in the main royal mews and in carriage storerooms on Marstall Platz, close to the Munich residence. The 2 vehicles that you see here are, in front, a garden carriage for a young prince, Prince Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria, probably French-made, and from the very late 17th century, circa 1697. The semi-domed head with yellow damask fabric, and then I don't know if you can just barely make it out there at the top, a stem-like metal finial makes it look like a pumpkin, and it was a garden vehicle. And then behind that is probably the most spectacular vehicle in the collection. It's the coronation coach, of course, fronted by a team of 8 horse mannequins. And the coronation coach was of Emperor Charles VII. It was built in Paris in the 1720s and used by Bavarian royals in the 18th century. It was eventually planned for use for King Ludwig II's wedding in 1867, but that wedding was called off, and so enormously heavy and impractical, requiring that many horses, it was not used again. We can go to the next slide. Speaking of Ludwig II, one of the first questions that often comes up is the connection of this collection and also of the Long Island Museum's vehicles to this famed king. A very colorful life. The Swan King, who ruled Bavaria during its time of transition during the Franco-Prussian War of the early 1870s, and of course the unification of Germany under Otto von Bismarck. Ludwig II, though, was not connected to the vehicles that I'm going to talk about with you directly in the collection of the Long Island Museum. He was, in fact, the nephew of the Prince Adalbert. If we go to the next slide. And in addition to some of the stunning ceremonial carriages and sleighs that you can see at Marstall Museum and the palace that you can see, if you go outside of Munich, you drive about an hour or a little bit more than that. There is, of course, the wonderful palace of Ludwig Neuschwanstein, and it is this dramatic, really wonderful palace, which I took this photograph when it was perfectly shrouded with clouds, a Disney-esque palace, or rather, I should say, Disney was copying Neuschwanstein, and it was built in honor of the composer Richard Wagner. So definitely worth a visit when you can go there again. Next slide, please. The king lived a complicated, chaotic, and short life, dying under murky and possible suicidal or even homicidal circumstances at the age of 41. There are romantic stories also of his moonlit sleigh rides, as depicted by this painting. And suffice it to say, the king and the rest of the Wittelsbach family set the tone for equestrian and carriage pursuits in their part of the world in the mid to late 19th century and earlier, of course. Next slide, please. At any rate, back to Prince Adalbert and his story. He again was the uncle of this famed king, and in 1856, the prince married the Spanish Infanta Amalia Felipe in a lavish wedding in Madrid. The wedding had been planned the year previous. It had been planned for 1855, but was delayed due to religious scheduling complications with the Catholic Church in Madrid. And we can go to the next slide. Thus, the merging of the Bourbon and Wittelsbach royal families, which is represented in the respective coat of arms on two of the vehicles that we'll be talking about on the sides. Next slide, please. Now, Adalbert and Amalia had 5 children, 2 boys, 3 girls. Their sons, Princes Ludwig Ferdinand and Alphonse, would end up owning 2 of the vehicles that we'll be talking about in a few minutes. Next slide. The entire family led an active lifestyle that included long coach rides outside of Munich into many parts of Bavaria. This is a surviving plein air watercolor by Princess Amalia, done sometime around 1870. Next slide. And this is the first Adalbert vehicle that we'll discuss that's at the Long Island Museum. This is a dress phaeton sleigh. It's actually one of 2 similar sleighs from Prince Adalbert that had been in the Long Island Museum's collection. The other was deaccessioned back in the summer of 1978. It looked very much like this one. It was in very, very difficult condition when it was deaccessioned. And it was sold at auction at Martin's that year. Several years ago, we were actually contacted and visited by Joel Brown, who is, as I understand, still busy restoring the one that used to be in our collection. This one, in its dark blue base color, actually a royal blue, but a little bit darker than some of the other vehicles, painted decoration and a red velvet seat back, cushions, armrests, likely dates to prior to the prince's marriage, as it has only his arms on the side. It would have been used in official state procession sleigh parties, very likely in long drives around the palace in winter months. It features wide gold borders and this very beautiful, like I think you can just barely make it out, beautifully painted acanthus foliage running along the border. And we can go to the next slide. Now the carving details on the running gear underneath the seat, and then here, as we see on this photograph of the top of one of the tall front arms, is really quite wonderful. And again, it's almost like a piece of Victorian furniture with that acanthus leaf decoration. Next slide. It's exceptionally well executed curved cast and wrought iron, but there are also several ornately carved wood blocks that are attached and cladded to the iron runners as well. The predominance of the metal work, and quite a lot of it, really just makes this vehicle extraordinarily heavy and difficult to move unless you're using multiple dollies. And so when we've moved it at the museum, it's taken a good number of us. Or of course it moves, I'm sure it moved very well in the snow and ice. I'm pretty sure of that. I've never tried it, but that would have been its purpose. Overall, the acanthus leaf detailing is, as I say, very reminiscent of furniture decoration, other types of decorative arts of the 19th century. Next slide. And at the top of those arms, you have beautiful white horsehair tassel plumes. And based upon some print reference sources, some of the official vehicles would certainly have been topped with plumes of ostrich feathers, not just something like this. There are also two small strips of black monkey hair, which decoratively trim the pageboard behind the seat. The fenders and the rear platform around the red velvet seat and other upholstery are edged by very fragile wound brass and silver wire tassels. And they are fragile indeed. We've had them repaired at several different times while the vehicle has been here. This, by the way, is one of two vehicles in the Long Island Museum's collection that was attributed to Franz Paul Gmelk the Elder, a master saddler and court carriage builder at the Residence Plaza in the mid-19th century, in the middle of Munich. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the other vehicle that was owned by Prince Adalbert that's in the museum's collection. This is a formal Berlin-style dress coach. It would have been used by him and possibly other officials in state business and short travels. It may also have been Adalbert and Amelia's wedding vehicle in Madrid in 1856. The carriage has very English coach-making characteristics. There is, I think you can make it out under the hammercloth up front, a Salisbury boot filling out the empty space under the coachman's seat. There are black lacquered upper quarters around the windows. Next slide. And as indicated on both the axle hubcaps as well as stamped upon the back of the leather steps to climb into the coach, this vehicle was made by Michael Staubwasser, who was the court saddler at Nymphenburg Palace starting in the 1850s. Staubwasser had been the court saddler since 1852, and according to one report in 1845, was known by then for building, quote, carriages of all kinds in the latest and most modern taste, and highly regarded for their, quote, elegance and solid construction, and especially the excellent quality of his iron, particularly in the springs. According to historian Rudolf Wackernagel, this vehicle appears to be the only one that survived from his shop. Next slide, please. And as shown before, the arms on the door handles and painted on the sides of the doors, you have featured both the families of the Wittelsbach and Bourbon. Okay, and we will go to the next slide. So here I'm taking you inside the vehicle, a plush, really beautiful interior trim featuring cream-colored brocades of a variety of different foliage patterns with high pile off-white carpeting on the floor. There are also, unfortunately, you can't really see in this photograph, rose-colored silk satin curtains that you could have pulled down on the windows for shade or privacy. By the way, I just want to make sure and clarify, because I think the photograph might confuse this. That red swag that you see that's in the window there, that's actually outside in the gallery. That's on the wall of the gallery. It's not part of the coach. In keeping with a monochromatic off-white, very, very light, bright interior color scheme, which was common to many of these Wittelsbach vehicles, all of the fittings are made of carved ivory. Next slide. And here we see a full image of the vehicle. Outside, covering that coachman's seat, there is a very sturdy, beautiful off-white wool hammer cloth. And maybe you can see in the middle of that an enameled Wittelsbach coat of arms in the center, surrounded by silk fringe and twisted silver red thread rosettes. The suspension of the vehicle is on C springs and scroll under the springs. And at the ends of the springs and other connecting parts, you have a really lovely carved and gilded leaf decoration. Next slide. So we're back to the prince, and this is the prince, of course, later in his life, not the image that we saw of him before in the print where he looks young and dashing and heroic. He's a little bit older, a little bit later. This is certainly after the Franco-Prussian War of the early 1870s. He greatly enjoyed collecting official seals of some of his famous contemporaries, as well as autographs. And like many individuals of the 19th century, he was extremely fond of spiritualism and readings by mediums, a belief in the afterlife. He also enjoyed hunting, equestrian, carriage-related pursuits. He died really young. He died when he was relatively young at the age of 47. And he actually passed away the same day as his sister Alexandra on September 21st, 1875. And I have checked 3 separate American newspaper obituary sources. None list the cause of his death at such an early age. That is something that I still need to find from the research. Next slide, please. So this is his son. This is Prince Ludwig Ferdinand, who was his eldest son and the owner of the next vehicle in the museum's collection that we'll talk about. Ludwig Ferdinand was one of only a few European princes doing an ordinary job outside of government or military. He worked as a surgeon and also gynecologist. During World War I, he was head of the surgery department of Munich Military Hospital. He was also Royal Colonel of the 18th Bavarian Infantry Regiment, as well as the Prussian Dragoons Regiment. Next slide, please. So this is his vehicle. This vehicle comes from an earlier time in his life, but there's documented evidence that it was used for many, many years. It is a fancy dress phaeton or Grand Duke carriage, sometimes known in this part of the world, in that part of the world, as a Hofwagen, made by a royal court carriage builder. Again, the royal court carriage builder, Franz Paul Gemelk the Elder, who we met before. And I think that the theme of this vehicle, very, very open, is that it's as much about the spectacle and being seen on the inside as anything else. Next slide. It is comfortably spacious. This gives you a good idea of its overall length, which is quite phenomenal. It's curvy, it has beautiful lines, very gorgeous, very wide leather dash and patent leather fenders, and a very long, low-lying royal blue painted body. with the painted insignia of the Wittelsbach royal prince. The paint, by the way, you can see very well in this photograph, and it's important to discuss because it's now much easier to read and appreciate than it once was when the museum had it. After the vehicle's conservation in the early 1990s by Brian Howard, when a yellowing varnish layer was removed, because before that it really had an unfortunate, more dark forest green cast to it. The boot for luggage or other storage is positioned up front, where you see those C springs. There is also a footman's seat in the rear where the handbrake is accessed over 4 semi-elliptic springs. It would have been driven postilion. This was a vehicle that facilitated a spectator's view, as we've said. There's really no side panels to obscure the view of the usually well-dressed royal passengers inside, as well as an easily rolled back hood. Rather perfect for squeezing in and out when you might be wearing an ample Victorian dress. It has comfortably plush interior with off-white silk and linen brocade in a crown pattern, and there are interior fittings, again, of carved ivory. Outside, you have silver-plated hardware. Next slide. Now, the design heritage echoes French carriage making, and this is you may have seen in the last slide, an image behind the vehicle. This is a different detail of the same image, the same print, and it echoes French carriage making, similar to what Gemelk would have seen in published trade catalog versions of French cabriolet Victorias, George IV Phaetons, or Dukes. And no doubt he would have seen inspiration on the park streets and paths around him. This vehicle is very similar to the form, to the types of elegant Victorians you would see in some of the fanciest drives and promenades of the late 19th century in London and Paris, and even in New York, of course, at Central Park, or Brooklyn at Prospect Park. Next slide, please. Here you can see what I was talking about before. This is an earlier photograph prior to its conservation. You see the difference there with the green, that it once really had more of a greenish cast to it. Next slide. So wonderfully, there is actually one historic photograph of the vehicle in use. This is dated June 22nd, 1914. And you can see the original lanterns, which unfortunately are no longer with this vehicle. The passengers are Prince Ludwig Ferdinand's sister-in-law, Princess Louise Victoria Sophie von Bern-Orléans, and her son, Prince Joseph Clemens, who became an art historian and fine art collector later in his life. Next slide. Princess Louise Victoria, who we just saw in that previous photograph, is here some 25 years earlier, having just married Ludwig Ferdinand's younger brother, Prince Alphonse. And they owned the next vehicle that I'll discuss that's in the museum's collection. Alphonse, as can be seen in this wedding photo, is in his dress uniform. He had a long military career. In 1892, he became commander of the Bavarian Schwerenreiter Regiment. And in 1905, he reached the rank of General of Cavalry, finishing his career as the commander of that regiment. Next slide. This is Alphonse's dress chariot, made by Binder Agne, or of the Madeleine district in 8th arrondissement in Paris around 1880. This was likely his long-standing personal dress carriage. It has his arms, but not the arms of his wife on the side of the vehicle. Next slide. Now, interestingly, this model can be seen in the pages of a Binder catalog from 1878, which is in our carriage reference library. In that publication, it was advertised as a coupe de ville, highly customizable invariably priced based on wealth at 7,000 or 12,000 francs. Binder was run by the brothers Charles and Henry, who were the sons of an Austrian carriage maker. Parisians referred to them as Princes de la Carrosserie. Binder made some of the finest dress carriages in the world. Like many carriage makers, Binder also eventually became known for their work on auto bodies in the 20th century, making chassis for Bugatti cars. Next slide. So while the vehicle in the catalog is identical in many respects, the suspension's perched on C-springs, the wheels are similar, there's fine hammer cloth with gimp lace, and you have a Salisbury boot, again, a curved one, which you can't really see too well under the hammer cloth, a seat in front, lanterns that are of a similar shape. There is naturally additional customized distinguishing features. There are more windows. There's a total of 4 plus the front glass, and then also a rear pocket window. And on the inside, it's just absolutely elegantly, beautifully trimmed off-white brocaded fabric, which is woven through and through with the royal arms. And the original lamps are silver plated. There's at the top of those lamps, I think you can probably see the crowns. As with each of these vehicles, we have that beautiful paint scheme, the royal blue paint scheme that's striped with gold leaf, white, and red. And you might see on the walls next to this vehicle, part of the gift, part of the donation were the harnesses that actually came with this vehicle from Dieter Holterbosch when we got it in the 1960s. Next slide. Of particular note, there's this beautiful enameled coat of arms, which features delicately light cast metal work, some of it painted to look as though it's carved rosewood, but in fact is metal on both sides of the hammer cloth. And the hammer cloth features yellow silk fringe with twisted silver threads. Also importantly, just to mention that this is in exceptional condition. Next slide, please. So we're going to watch a very, very brief little film clip. This is colorized film of a state event in Munich around 1910, a few years before World War I. And this is of course colorized. You're seeing a few of vehicles in the center of Munich that were used by royal families and also used in public events. Not any of the vehicles that we've talked about tonight. All of the surviving vehicles from the Wittelsbach clan remained at the palace and on the grounds of the palace throughout World War I, through the fall of the monarchy in 1918, and then on through the tumult of the Nazi regime in World War II. How did it get here, though? And that's what we'll talk about in our next slide. So in 1958, all of the vehicles that we've been discussing were purchased by Dieter Holterbosch, born 1921, died in 2016, a German-American beer distributor of Lowenbrau. Holterbosch acquired them, and as you can see from this New York Times article, which documented their transport on May 26, 1959, Alphonse's chariot is the one that's being moved at New York Harbor. It took a number of years for all of them to become part of the collection of the museum. Holterbosch donated the collection piecemeal, not all at once, making separate donations to us throughout the mid to late 1960s. And you might wonder why, how did he know about us? Well, he was a part-time resident of nearby Belle Terre, a very wealthy community, which is about 10 to 15 minutes away from the museum. And in all honesty, this was an unusual acquisition, though, for him. He'd been born in Dusseldorf, Germany. He emigrated here at the age of 5, then served in the Coast Guard during World War II. He was a graduate of Penn State. And after making it big, really ended up becoming a collector of antique automobiles and an authority on them as well. In fact, you see him here at a 1962 car auction on Long Island in front of his prized new acquisition, a 1931 Duesenberg Speedster. Next slide. And this is actually his grand auto collection of photographs taken about 10 years ago. He moved on to Cove Neck, Long Island, which is in Oyster Bay. It's about 45 minutes west of where he lived before. And that's where he lived the rest of his life. So an unusual acquisition for him to get these vehicles, but quite an incredible generous gift, and quite a wonderful gift that we have been happy with for many years. Next slide, please. We talked about the fact that he also gave us harnesses. He in fact also gave us a donation of several postilion caps, and these are currently in the gallery in a case nearby that also features a pair of very early postilion boots that you see there on the right side of the case. Next slide. And this is a close-up of one of those hats, and it's great to have this material because it really contextualizes the vehicles. There are many prints and some photographs that detail and show what postilion riding was like at this time, and it's great to have original artifacts that help show it too. So we'll go to the next slide. And finally, tonight, we're going to arrive at this golden beauty. It's a Berlin coach with original exterior of gilded wood and fine painted embellishments. It truly is a rare survivor of the late 18th century, with its exterior surviving intact, although the hammercloth that you see there and the interior upholstery was restored at some point in its more recent history. We don't know the maker, but it's believed to have been made in France and then spent much of its life on the Italian peninsula for 170 some years before arriving at the museum's collection as a purchase in late 1953. Next slide. Now, of importance in terms of the carriage's construction history, a Berlin coach was a style that was invented in the mid-17th century, named for the Prussian capital city, Berlin, at the time, and had a very innovative suspension design. It had an undercarriage which had two, not one, and it's hard to tell in this photograph, but there are two perches, not a single heavy one. And as you can see here, they connect to the front and the rear axles. This helped to balance the weight of the coach and really improved the carriage's stability, gave it a balanced movement. I can tell you that you feel that when you move it. And also, it has the crane-necked curve at the front of the perch that allows the front wheels of the Berlin to move under the body. The actual connection of the vehicle's body is via very heavy leather braces that connect to the whip springs. And as you'll see in a historic video that we're going to see in another few minutes, it swings a bit, but not too much. It's a fairly smooth ride for the late 1700s. Another really important thing that we will spend a little bit of time on with this vehicle is its great painted details. There are allegorical figures painted on the doors and the front and the back. Next slide. This is a close-up of a repeating banderole pattern below the windows of reclining lions and a wing-spread eagle, which were emblems of the Pianetti family that owned the vehicle. You can also see a really wonderful flourish of fruit, ribbons, flowers, other lovely painted details. Next slide. The origins of the allegorical figures on the doors can be traced to fresco paintings from the Farnese Palace in Rome. paintings of various trials and tribulations of the gods, including Hercules, done by the Italian artist Annibale Carracci. This is based on the fresco Hercules and Iole. It's the left door. And the point of such decorations, I mean, why paint this wonderful art on your coach? It really helps to emphasize for the Italian nobility that owns it a lineage of greatness. And while we see the original fresco here at the right, I think it's also important, of course, to note that the painter of the coach is likely working from a print source. He is working from a reproduction of that original painting. And it was widely published. There were many prints done from those Carracci fresco paintings that were published in both Italy and France throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Next slide. Now, the front panel depicts Hercules slaying the Hydra. And here, the original image source is murkier. But the important thing, again, is why. Why were these representative paintings chosen? And the reference, I think, associates the owners with some of the same attributes that are being portrayed by the figures in these stories. Courage, steadfastness, strength, being virtuous. Next slide. The carving on this vehicle is also worth describing. There's a lion's head at the rear center edge. There are classical carved heads at the top of each of the pilasters. And here you see at the middle of the footboard, there's this carved head of what appears to be Medusa. Next slide. So the Berlin coach spent its life first with the Pianetti family in Rome. It was used by Cardinal Gaspar Bernardo Pianetti, a high prelate of the pontifical court under Pope Pius IX. And then it traveled up the Adriatic coastline to Jesi, eventually being moved to Villa San Ubaldo, and then later another family palace, which we see here in Arsivia. Next slide. And that's where it stayed until James Archibald Keeler, who was vice president at B. Altman, and also, I should point out, an early member of the Carriage Association of America, a friend of Ward Melville's, who was the founder of this museum. He served as the purchasing agent for its acquisition. Keeler was a frequent global traveler and was donor to the collection. He was also involved as an agent in the acquisition of at least one other vehicle from England. In a summer letter to Richard Gibson, who was the museum's curator at the time, Keeler mentions that, quote, "I have written further about the carriage in Italy, but I have not yet had an answer. I'm reasonably sure that it will be available for us. The Italians, however, do not attend to things or answer correspondence with the promptness of our English friends." Next slide. Nonetheless, the deal was done, and in the fall of 1953, arrangements were made for its transport. A letter from an Italian shipping company that's in our files indicated that the packing of the vehicle was made with great care. The wheel axles were bolted to the case with 4 iron stirrups. The coach itself was also secured with iron straps. The movers suggested that, quote, "Even if the crate is turned upside down, the coach cannot possibly move." Next slide. And on December 12th, 1953, Ward Melville writes in his diary, "I saw the new Cardinal's coach." So it took a few weeks, but it managed to make its way finally out to Stony Brook and quickly became one of the stars of this collection. The Berlin had only been here in Stony Brook for a few years before it was requested for loan by Colonial Williamsburg Foundation for their film The Making of a Patriot, which played for many years in their visitor center. And we're going to see a clip of this vehicle. You'll see it actually riding down Duke of Gloucester Street with a team of 4 and postilion riders, fully attended. And there it goes. And naturally, this would never have been the vehicle that you would have actually seen in 18th century Virginia streets, but it still leaves quite an amazing impression. And maybe you can, despite the jerky quality of the video, get some sense of its stability too, which is quite wonderful. Okay, next slide. We are finishing up here. There are just two other vehicles on view in this gallery. We'll just quickly talk about them real fast beyond what I've chosen to discuss with you in depth tonight. The oldest carriage in our collection, it's an Italian gig, which you see there on the left, that dates to about 1670, a full century older than the Berlin. Next slide. And this really whimsical, wonderful single passenger carved sleigh that's in the shape of a lion, created from a single piece of wood, possibly Bavarian or French, from the late 18th century. There's a red velvet driver's seat behind the low sitting passenger within the body of the lion. And this, by the way, was another vehicle that we had acquired for us by James Keeler. And so all in all, the European vehicles that we've discussed here tonight mark an important contrast with the museum's predominantly American collection, and especially the carriages, wagons, and sleighs of the industrial era. You know, we may not have the biggest carriage collection here, but we do have one that has amazing breadth and versatility. Looking closely at the vehicles that we've looked at tonight underlines the incredible craftsmanship and the small shop artisan skills of fine coachmakers and their colleagues working in court stables. The truly very skilled builders of Europe's capital cities and royal families, but also the fact that these builders were influenced by what was the current norm in design, the current trends in design of carriage construction in the mid-19th century. So as rare survivors on American soil, this collection transports us to a different time and place. And for lovers of fine carriages, there's nothing like this in such concentration anywhere, unless you buy yourself a plane ticket, which you can't really do so easily now. So when it is safe to travel again, of course, you can see this amazing collection, but you can also go across the Atlantic to Western Europe to places like the Marstall Museum or the incredible Imperial Carriage Museum in Vienna. Thank you very much for spending time with us tonight, and I appreciate the attention, the interest, and we'll be happy to talk about some things in the next few minutes.
Thank you so much, Josh. I really appreciate you joining us tonight. That was a great presentation. I did want to let you know we have members joining us all the way from Argentina tonight. Wow. And wow, great. Ken Wheeling is also joining us tonight. This is his first time online for us.
Wonderful.
So
that's great.
Yes. So if you have any questions, you can use the chat feature to ask them, and then I'll relay them to Josh. And that is the little bubble that kind of looks like a thought bubble. You can type your question right in there. I did want to go back just real quick to this vehicle back here about a question that I think is going to pop up. And we're going to use our handy dandy pen. So when you were, oh, wrong color. When you were talking about the crane neck, I think this is what you were referring to. I just wanted to highlight it.
Correct. You can see it there at the end of the perches. It has that crane neck or gooseneck shape, and the wheels can turn naturally and go under where the perches are, giving it a much better range of motion.
Yes, because we don't see that a lot on it just in general, and I thought that was really interesting and wanted to make sure that everybody understood how that is working and what it does for the vehicle as far as being able to turn. So we're getting in lots of comments that this is very interesting, wonderful, thank you. And so we're going to go back just a little bit more. Oops, that drawing is going to stay there apparently. Sorry. Let me see if I can get rid of that. I've never had it stay there before.
Huh.
Okay, well, it's been one of those weeks, so
Not
we're just
like,
gonna roll.
not like an Etch-a-Sketch, yeah.
We're just gonna roll with it. It's
Yeah,
Friday.
that's fine.
Oh, so we'll just ignore that. We had talked about this before, the detail on the sleigh at the very beginning,
Mhm.
and you had mentioned that the wrought iron is actually inside. Yeah, actually, this works great. The little the circle goes right around the little carving if you want it.
Yeah,
So this is wood mounted on
you're actually
iron.
looking at, well, at that part, you're looking at wood.
Yes,
And,
okay.
it's pieced together. I think there's another close-up that shows it actually pieced together.
Yes.
Down below, you're looking, yeah, right. So you can see the gap there. Down below, in the runners and the running gear, there's much more metal than wood, but there is some really wonderful wood carving in there too, and it's actually cladded, attached to the metal, and just a great pattern, really quite wonderful, and it's held up very well.
Great. And of course it does have the square um, nuts on it. And they're not round, which is part of how when they do the carrot showcase, they always looked for that type of thing. And
Mhm.
so now Ken and everybody has taught me to look for
Very good.
that. And you had mentioned earlier, what type of, these are lilies?
No, acanthus leaves.
Campus leaves.
Acanthus, Acanthus. And of course, if if you look at any decorative arts collection of the 19th century, American or European, mid 19th century, is a very, very common motif, and uh, just a wonderful pattern to see in this vehicle and several other vehicles that are not in our collection, but actually in the Marstall Museum's collection.
And you mentioned that this one is incredibly heavy.
Oh
Do you
yeah.
have an estimate as to how much it might weigh?
I boy, that's a good question. I know that I can say that it takes, every time that we've moved it on dollies, it's taken 4 of us to move it very carefully. I it's hundreds of pounds, but I don't know that I can give you an exact estimate on that. It's
Just curious.
it's
Is
a
it?
heavy beast.
Yeah, and it looks like it was 2 horses, and so you wonder what type of animals would have been used to pull such a heavy vehicle. Um, we do have some questions coming in, and Melanie was asking, are any of these carriages and sleighs tied into the Marshall Museum in Munich? I think
Um,
that's
so they belong, these vehicles belong to this museum that we've talked about, but they're, of course, they are connected to the vehicles that you can see at the Marstall Museum, because some of the same makers, whether they be Gemelk or Staubwasser, that made these vehicles, made some of the vehicles that you'd see in Munich. Now, I should say that they, of course, know very well about this collection that's here. And back in the early 2000s, historian Rudolf Wackernagel and other members of the team of the Marstall Museum put together several really wonderful catalogs about the Wittelsbach state and ceremonial carriages. They're just spectacular, just really wonderful books, published, I think, in 2002, and just great resources. And you can see, by looking at that, you can definitely see these in the full context of the collection of vehicles that you can see at the Palace in Munich.
wonderful. Now, you mentioned earlier that the Long Island Museum has a reference department for the carriages. What type of material do you have there?
We do, and Ken Wheeling knows it well. Ken has used it before. It is a treasure trove. It has a collection of carriage prints, of reference literature from the 1800s, the 1700s, the 1900s. There is great material on individual companies. We have records and photographs from Henry Hooker, from Brewster. One of the most incredible things in the collection is the unpublished autobiography of James Brewster, his life. It's really quite incredible, and it's a great collection. I think anything that you can imagine, whether it be sort of trade journals of the late 19th century, or if you wanted to see some visual reference sources of that put some of the vehicles that you might own in context, we have it here, and it's a great resource. So just something to keep in mind. There, right now during this time, it's not open and available for on-site visitation, but we hope naturally once we get through the pandemic that it will be open again for people to come visit. But in the meantime, we have it here, and I just wanted to let that be known that it's a research resource for people if they have questions or if there are things they're trying to find out.
Is that open to the general public or by appointment?
In normal times, it's open by appointment, and as I say, right now, it's unfortunately,
yes.
Given the difficulty, it's hard for us to accommodate anybody.
Yes, we appreciate you taking the time to do this, because we know that you've gone actually back into the museum tonight to be able to join us, and we do greatly appreciate that. I just wanted to let everyone know that this webinar has been recorded, and it will be available in the members only area of the CAA website in approximately 2 hours, possibly less, but usually within the next 2 hours. And so you can access it there if you were not able to watch the entire session. I know we've had several people join us along the way. And I'd like to thank everybody again for joining us tonight. We will be back next month, and we will be doing, a gentleman will be joining us from Circus World. So we are going to switch from the elegance of these phaetons and very royal vehicles and go to the bright world of the circus for next month. Thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you again, Joshua, for giving this wonderful presentation, great photos, and just a wonderful job. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing some of you in the near future. Stay safe and stay well, and ride on.
Thank you.